Hey everybody, so in this video I'm going to take you through the evolution of football helmets from the 19th century up until the year 2000. This is going to be a little break from my normal picking videos. They'll be back next week. I've been meaning to make this video for a while. I made a similar evolution of the baseball glove video earlier in the year. Got a lot of good feedback on that video, so I wanted to make this one. It is a ton of work to make this style video for me, so I hope you guys enjoy it. If you do, please subscribe, click that like button, and hit the notification bell. In the 1870s through the 1880s, the only thing players would wear on their heads, if anything, would be wool skull caps. These would be very similar to modern, winter hats you would wear outside. Players weren't really wearing this for any type of protection, but more to identify themselves as teammates. At that point, players were wearing pretty drab, canvas-colored uniforms. The only two things that would identify one team from another would be striped sleeves or these colored skull caps that would be in the color of the school or the team. This is an example of a skull cap worn by a Dartmouth player, I believe in the 1880s. These skull caps don't show up often, and if you can find one that has some type of provenance that can tie it to a particular school or player, I would say the value is going to be in the $2,000 to $3,000 range. In this 1894 Spalding football guide, you can see the skull caps still pictured and still for sale, but also this guide marks the first appearance of a football helmet, really called a football head harness, in a catalog. This head harness was the Spalding number 25. This was invented by George Barclay, who was a Lafayette College football player, also went on to become a professional football and baseball player. But he invented this helmet less about protecting his head, more about protecting his ears from cauliflower ear, which is also more commonly referred to in modern times as wrestler's ear. So these basically were thick padding over either one or two ears with a simple strap that would go across the head. These are exceedingly rare. There's one in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. If one would come up for sale, I'd expect that head harness to bring $15,000 to $20,000 depending on condition. Okay, next up in the late 1890s was introduced the 4-spoke head harness. I'm showing here the 1899 Spalding guide catalog. These were used into the early 1900s, made by Reach, Spalding, and you'll occasionally find some handmade, like local shoemaker made helmets. These are going to bring somewhere in the $2,500 to $6,000 range depending on the maker, the condition. Next up we have one of the more desirable, rare style of helmets, and it's called the Chicago style Spalding number 30 head harness. This helmet was only produced from 1901 to 1903, so a very short-lived production run. You almost never see these come up for sale. One was found in the attic of a hardware store several years ago in like immaculate condition. That was an amazing find, but generally these never show up. If one did come up for sale, I'd expect it to bring $8,000 to $12,000 depending on condition. Following the Chicago helmet in the timeline is probably an equally rare type of helmet, and it's the Spalding pneumatic helmet. These helmets were introduced in 1903. I show it on the cover of the 1903 Spalding guide right here. These were very short-lived and weren't a very successful style helmet, but they involved an inflatable ring in the interior of the helmet, trying to add a little extra cushion for protecting its head injuries, but didn't catch on. Obviously it didn't sell well. You almost never see these come up for sale. If they did come up for sale, depending on condition, you're going to expect to fetch $8,000 to $12,000 range, up to $20,000 for very nice condition helmets. Used around the same time as the pneumatic head harness was the improved head harness. And this was a harder shell helmet made of sole leather. These were used up until about 1904. The value of these helmets probably going to fall in the $2,500 to $5,000 range. They don't show up too often. Next in the line after that was the rain cap head harness. These came to prominence around 1900, continuing through the 1910s. At this time, fatal injuries in the game of football were all too common, with 25 people dying playing football in 1903 alone. A lot of those were prep school football players. 2 years later, Teddy Roosevelt Jr. suffered a significant facial injury playing football at Harvard, and undoubtedly spurred by that injury, President Roosevelt threatened to ban the game of football. In response to that, President Roosevelt met with college leaders and and a lot of rule changes were instituted to make the game safer, but also sole leather helmets were banned. So that's one of the reasons rain cap helmets, which were a softer, foldable helmet made of leather, moleskin, or canvas — moleskin is like a suede-like material — become the predominant helmet used. I show several of these style helmets here, including a Schmelzer's brand rain cap head harness that I have currently in my eBay store. The value of a rain cap head harness going to be in the $750 to $2,000 range depending on condition. Following rain cap helmets came the helmet which most people associate with football in the 1910s era, the flat top style leather helmet. These helmets appeared at around 1904 and were predominantly used through the 1910s, with some still being produced as late as the early 1920s. These helmets consisted of quilted, padded leather, canvas, or moleskin bodies with a flat, ventilated top. The value of a flat top head harness could be about the same as the rain cap, $750 up to $2,000 depending on condition. In the early 1910s came another type of relatively rare flat top helmet called the Princeton style flat top, and these were used into their early 1920s. These helmets consisted of a leather body with a flat leather top attached by 4 triangular pieces of leather. I've handled several of these style helmets over the years, and I was always struck just how lightweight these were. Very thin leather, very little padding inside. These Princeton style helmets are going to fetch in the $1,500 to $2,500 range depending on condition. Another very similar helmet to the Princeton style flat top was the Harvard style flat top. These are almost identical other than they don't attach via those triangular pieces of leather, and the value is going to be the same for these helmets as well. Alright, next up is a helmet used around the same time period as the Harvard and Princeton flat top helmets, and that is a molded crown head harness. These helmets have a similar appearance to the rain cap head harness, but these have a hard shell. The value of these helmets is going to be in the $500 to $750 price range. Next in the timeline is a type of helmet used over a wide period of time from the late 1910s up until about 1930, and it's known as a dog-ear leather football helmet. These are also known as a Western style head harness and were made by a bunch of different companies. The value of these helmets, depending on condition and maker, is going to be between the $250 to $600 price range. Next up is one of my favorite types of football helmets, and it's the executioner helmet. These helmets were used from about 1925 to the early 1930s and were marketed to and generally used by players who had previous facial injuries. Undoubtedly, they weren't a very common helmet, and thus they very rarely show up. These helmets came in 3 basic types: a full facial covering helmet like the one shown here, where the face covering extends down to the chin. It also comes in a half face style, where the face covering extends just below the nose. And lastly, it comes in a 2-piece style with a separate leather facial covering that the player would wear with a standard type of football helmet. I've been able to handle 2 of these over the years: this 2-piece Spalding executioner helmet and this Draper and Maynard half-face football helmet, which was the most favorite helmet that I've ever handled. These rarely ever come up for sale, but when they do, depending on condition, depending on style, they're likely to fetch between the $5,000 and $12,000 price range. Next in the timeline is a helmet that was used very briefly for a few years in the early 1930s. And this is the 8 attachment Princeton style helmet. These helmets bear a very similar look to the earlier Princeton style flat top helmets, except they had 8 triangular leather attachments, and these rarely ever show up. But when they do, they could be expected to bring in the $1,500 to $2,000 price range. Next up, running from the late 1920s into the 1940s, were a pair of helmet styles. First, the leather fiber reinforced football helmets, and then the fiber exposed crown helmets. The first of these, the fiber reinforced helmets, were leather football helmets with some interior fiber support to add protection. They came in a variety of styles. The earlier ones, like the 4-strap shown here, would have been in the late 1920s. You also had 8-strap helmets where you had 8 strips of leather running across the helmet like these 2 here. There were wing front design helmets like this pair, and then you had shield front helmets like this one here. There are some other more obscure styles, but these are the basic styles that you'll encounter. The value of these, barring a tie to a specific school or player, are going to be in the $200 to $400 price range. Next, you had the exposed fiber crown helmets. These helmets, as you can see, had a top of exposed fiber without any leather support. These helmets came in the same styles. I show a pair of wing front helmets here, as well as a pair of shield front helmets This particular shield front helmet was a game-used University of Pennsylvania helmet that I handled in the past, and you can see Chuck Bednarik wearing the same style helmet in this image here. Barring this type of provenance, these helmets are typically going to bring in the $100 to $200 price range. Although plastic helmets were first introduced in 1939, they were initially very poor quality, especially in World War II when shortages led to pretty poor quality materials. So leather helmets were still being used pretty readily in college and the NFL, and it wasn't until 1949 that really changed.
All right, so all the helmets from this point forward are going to be game-used Philadelphia Eagles helmets. I'm not going to put any value on these helmets because, moving through the 60s into the 70s, 80s, and so on, so much of the value is going to be dictated by the team, the player. This segment of the video is going to be more about showing the transition of the helmets, showing the transition of the suspension inside the helmets, rather than values. Thank you for watching thus far. Hope you keep watching. Go Birds!
Alright, so the Philadelphia Eagles would wear leather helmets from their inception in 1933 up through the 1948 season. And this style leather helmet was worn through most of the 1940s, including the 1948 NFL championship season. The following year, in 1949, the NFL officially adopted the plastic helmet, and this helmet is a 1949 Joe Muha game-use helmet. It's a Rydell RT clear shell helmet. These helmets had a clear coating, which often will yellow a bit with age, giving this helmet a green and gold look, while it's actually a green and silver helmet. The Eagles wore this helmet design from 1949 to 1952. The following year, they moved to just an all-green helmet, like this helmet here, and they wore this for the 1953 and 1954 seasons. You're going to be seeing here there's very little advancement in the suspension through the 1950s, even into the early 1970s. This helmet is a 1955 Rob Good game-worn helmet. This is the first year the Eagles would wear their classic wings on the helmet. You can see there's some holes in the front of this helmet that were for a tie-on mask, although I don't believe Rob Good ever wore a mask. These holes would have been prepared for all helmets. Although face masks were becoming more common, they were not mandated fully until 1962. And Bobby Lane, shown here with the Pittsburgh Steelers, I believe was the last player not to wear a face mask. Moving on, this helmet, a 1961 Gene Gossage game-worn Rydell Craylite helmet. You can see there is a major advancement in face masks by this point. Then, worn from the 1969 to 1973 seasons, the Eagles wore a white helmet with green wings, like the one shown here. Again, you can see the suspension, very little change from the 1950s. In 1974, the Eagles moved to the Kelly green helmet, once again, like the game-worn helmet shown here. This helmet is a 1978 game-worn helmet, and we're finally starting to see some advancement in the suspension. This helmet is a late 1980s game-worn helmet, and then moving into the early 90s, we have a 1992 Keith Byers game-worn helmet. This helmet is missing its crown padding inside. The Eagles would wear the Kelly green silver wing helmet until 1995, until which time they moved to their modern style helmet, like the 2000 Charles Johnson game-worn helmet shown here. So that concludes 106 years of helmet evolution. Hope you enjoyed watching. If you did, again, please subscribe, click that like button, click that notification bell.